Today's message is our identity, or you can also title it, Our Greatest Excuses. See, most men find their identity and their self-worth from the three primary sources, which I like to call it the three W's: our work, our wealth, and our woman. These are also the three main excuses that keep us from going to where Jesus is leading us to go. Now, Jesus taught about these three W's in the parable of the Great Banquet. And you also see these three W's in the original commission that God gave to all mankind. He said, be fruitful and multiply. Well, that requires a woman. Fill the earth. That's about creating wealth, getting new fields, new territory. And then finally, he says, rule and eat of the fruit and vegetables of the land that you're ruling over. And that's work. So it's not that these three things are bad, but these three things are part of our commission, but many times we make it our calling. And the challenge with that is that it also becomes our three main excuses from doing what God has called us to do. So this parable of the Great Banquet, or as I like to call it, the parable of the great excuses, is found in Luke chapter 14, verses 16 and 20, and also 24 of NIV. Jesus replied and said, a certain man was preparing a great banquet, invited many guests. And at the time of the banquet, he sent his servants to tell those who had been invited, come, for everything is ready now. But they all alike began to make excuses. The first said, I just bought a field, and I must go and see it. I'm sorry, please excuse me. And I call that the wealth excuse. The other said, I just bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I'm on my way to try them out. Please excuse me. That's the work excuse. Still another said, I just got married, so I can't come. That's the woman excuse. Jesus goes on to say, I tell you, not one of those who were invited will get the taste of my banquet. And now there's a similar teaching and similar warning in the parable of the wedding banquet found in Matthew chapter 22, verses 1 through 5, and also 14 of the NIV. Jesus spoke to them again in a parable, saying, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who prepared a wedding banquet for his son. Now he sent his servants to those who had been invited to the banquet to tell them to come, but they refused to come. Then he sent even more servants and said, tell those who have been invited that I've prepared my dinner. The oxen, the fattened calf, they've all been butchered. Everything's done. It's all ready. So come to the wedding banquet. But they paid no attention, and then they went off. One to his field, that's his wealth. The other to his business, that's work. Jesus went on to say, many are invited, but very few are chosen. Now, this parable didn't have the wife excuse, and that may have been because this was about a wedding banquet, but it did have that wealth and work excuses. I want you to think about it. How many times, or how often, have you told God no because you thought your wife wouldn't let you do what God has asked you to do? I recently met this guy down in downtown Charleston, really nice guy. We hit it off and he's just sharing life experiences. And he said that his wife loves to purchase racehorses, and she purchased another one, but was advised not to tell her husband. Luckily, she came up with a creative way of telling him. They were watching the horse race, and he saw one of the horses and said, don't tell Darren. That was the name of the horse. And what makes it even funnier is that his name Darren is spelled like no other way that you would normally spell the name Darren. So he knew that it was referring to him. And I'm not suggesting that you hide from your spouse what God's calling you to do. And luckily, by the way, that horse won the race. So it actually turned out to be a prompting, a leading from God. It was a confirmation. But so I'm not saying don't hide things from your spouse. What I am saying is that don't use your spouse as an excuse to do what God's called you to do. Go with your spouse to the Lord to seek clarity. Your calling, it was set before you were ever born, but the timing of its fulfillment may not have arrived yet. And that's why God puts people like your spouse in your life to help you determine those timing. And don't take timing into your own hands, but let God lead. For example, Abraham's name got changed to the name that means father of many nations. But yet he didn't have an heir. He didn't have a child. And so he got frustrated with God and eventually slept with his wife's servant and had a child through her. And that's not what God asked him to do. Moses knew that he was called to help deliver the Israelites from the Egyptians. His name even meant delivered by water. And yet he tried to deliver them by his own hands. And eventually had to flee the nation of Egypt and leave in disgrace as a murderer. It wasn't until 40 years later that God came to him and said, I want you to go back and deliver my people. And he eventually did deliver them by water. Think about the story of how the greatest obstacle and looked like the greatest thing that was going to keep them from their freedom was the Red Sea. And yet God used the Red Sea to deliver the Israelites from their enemies. King David, he was anointed king, but it wasn't until 13 years later that he became a king. Joseph was anointed to be a ruler, and that his family would actually bow down and submit to his rule. And yet that didn't happen until 13 years later. Jesus, Son of God, born the Son of God, didn't receive power to heal or raise the dead back to life until 30 years later. And it wasn't until he was baptized that God publicly announced that this is my son. It wasn't until that happened, and that's the same way for you, until you realize that you are God's son, you're his adopted son. You're not going to walk in the full identity in which God has called you to be, and you won't have the power and the strength to do what God has called you to do. So the first thing you got to do is acknowledge who owns you. Who is your daddy? And you might be saying, I don't have enough wealth to do what God's asked me to do. And you're probably right, because it's not your wealth, it's God's wealth. You just have to ask God and seek, knock. Ask the people that he's called you to ask. Well, you probably don't have enough time. You probably don't. You're probably working too much. And your boss probably won't let you off from work. And so you can't do what God asked you to do. Well, you can keep on believing that lie and never fulfill your calling. You could do that. God gives you the free will to do that. Or you can ask. And maybe through your boss, God will provide the wealth you need to do what God has called you to do. Our excuses, sadly, are many times rooted in our identity and what we value and love the most, or fear losing the most. And whatever we value over following Jesus is what God calls an idol. And it will prevent us from being who God called us to be. Our identity should not be based on what we own or what we do, but on who owns us and what our owner has designed us to do. God has a name, or has multiple names he calls you. To call yourself something that's contradictory to what God is calling you is to call God a liar. You need to receive and listen from God. What is the name he's called you? What is the name that he has sown inside of you? Because this calling, this name, is like the seed sown in Matthew 13, verses 18 through 23 of the NIV. Jesus said, listen to the parable of the sower and what it means. If anyone hears the message about the kingdom, if anyone hears their calling, what God calls them, and doesn't understand it, the evil one will come and snatch away what was sown in their heart. And that's what the seed is that's sown among the path. Now, a seed that falls on the rocky ground refers to someone who hears the word and at once receives it with joy. So they hear their name, their calling, and they receive it at once with joy. But since it has no root, it only lasts for a short time. And when trouble or persecution comes because of that word, that calling, they quickly fall away. And the seed that's sown among the thorns, well, that refers to someone who hears the word. But the worries of this life, or basically the fear of this life, from losing your wife or losing your job, and the deceitfulness of wealth, well, they choke out this message, this word, this calling that God has called you, and it make it unfruitful. But the seed that falls on good soil refers to someone who hears the word and understands it. So they understand their name, they understand it, and it produces a crop yielding 100, 60, or 30 times what was sown. So it's so important that you first take the time to understand what your name means, and that it has deep roots, and that you protect it from the thorns. That's the worries of this life and the deceitfulness of wealth. So that word can take root in your heart and grow through the weeds and avoid those thorns to produce a crop yielding 100 times what was sown. And for this root, this seed to take place in your heart and grow, you've got to be willing, available, and obedient to whatever God asks you to do. And stop using the excuses of wealth, work, and woman from doing what God has called you to do. Remember this. Worship, it means to bow down and to submit and be led by another. You will worship whatever you love the most or fear the most of losing. So if you love your work, your wealth, and your wife above God, then you will worship your work and your wealth or your wife above being led by God. And if you fear losing those things, then fear avoidance will be what you'll worship and you'll be led by. Your decisions and your choices will be based on fear instead of love. That's why God says that you are to only fear losing his presence. That's the only thing in life you should ever fear. Because if he is with you, you are victorious. And the other thing that you should love above all other things is God. And when you love God with all your heart and you fear life not having God with you, then you're at the place God wants you to be. And instead of letting people define who you are, you let God define who you are becoming, and who you will be. By receiving and believing the name God calls you. And to call yourself anything contradictory to what God calls you is to call God a liar. So it's so important that you receive what God is saying to you. As in Matthew 4, chapter 19 of ESV, it says, Jesus says, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." Now notice, Jesus doesn't say, become, and then you can follow me. Jesus is inviting them to follow him, and he'll make them become who he's called them to be. So it's not about following a to-do list. It's about following God. And God brings us to him. God calls us to bring our identity and our calling into our vocation, instead of getting our identity and our calling from our vocation. And you can change that word vocation to be work. You could change it to be woman. God calls our identity and our calling into our marriage instead of getting our identity and our calling from our marriage. God calls our identity and our calling to our wealth instead of getting our identity and calling from our wealth. So what I'm trying to say to you is that your identity comes from following God, not from following rules or a to-do list, because that drives you into bondage and it automatically produces failure and burden. Versus following God, well, following God drives you into freedom and produces joy and strength to accomplish what God has called you to do. Now, you may not believe you're good enough and that the name that God calls you, that there's no way He can call you that. You are so far from what He's called you to be. If that's the case, then you're exactly where God wants you to be. Because all throughout the scriptures, we see God asking people who believe that they're not good enough. And the truth is, they are not good enough. And they know without God leading them, they are powerless. But yet they also know that when God is with them and they're following God, God is all that they need. That's why they fear losing His presence over any other thing. And they love God more than any other thing. They love being in His presence. And so often, God invites people to go on an adventure with Him. And they feel like it's all up to them to make it happen. And when they start feeling that way, if you start feeling that way, you're actually separating yourself from God, and you're taking on a burden that God had never asked you to take on. Jesus said, "My yoke is easy and my burden is light." That's in Matthew 11, verse 30 of the NIV. His yoke is easy and His burden is light. If you're feeling what you're doing is overwhelming and that it's draining you, then you're not following God. It doesn't mean that your calling isn't going to have challenges. In fact, that you're promised to have persecution and trouble as you follow your calling. But when God is with you, you're able to consider all things joy and be grateful and thankful in all circumstances. For this is the will of God, because you're walking with God, and it serves a purpose greater than you could ever understand. And when you understand God's character and know that He's for you and not against you, and that if He's walking you through these situations that just seem overwhelming, but if you stay focused on Him and focus on His character, then you'll recognize God's leading and be able to understand and translate what God's asking you to do. And sometimes He'll even show you why, but He doesn't have to. What you have to do is trust. When Jesus began His full-time ministry, it was right after He got baptized. He completely surrendered, basically bowed down. And the first thing that you hear, and the first thing that everyone hears that's there when Jesus gets baptized, is a voice from heaven saying that this is my Son, in which I'm well pleased. And from that identity, Jesus is now able to live out His calling. And it's the same thing with you. Before you could do anything great in the kingdom of God, you first got to understand who you are. You are God's adopted son. So ask God, what do you call me? What do you call me, God? What do you say about me, God? How do you describe me, God? If you're going to wake me up in the middle of the night, God, what name would you call out to wake me up that's distinct to who I am, to who you've designed me to be? God is asking you to know what He calls you, to know the names that He calls you. And we're going to be walking through that over the next few weeks. And I'm excited that you're walking with us on this journey, and pray that God uses it to bless you in so many ways. Take care, my friend.